All right, we are set. And now I'm super happy to welcome Jarrett Dapier, a youth librarian at Skokie Public Library and the host for our program.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for attending tonight. I am incredibly thrilled and honored to be able to have this opportunity to talk with Francisco X. Stork, who has been one of my favorite YA writers for over 10 years now. I've been working in teen services and public libraries since 2009. And when I first started as a YA librarian, I was falling in love with young adult literature. It was a slow process, and book by book, I truly felt that this was a type of literature that truly connected with me and that promised riches and deep characters and storylines that I found very meaningful. And it was when I found Marcelo in the Real World, a little bit into my first year working in teen services by Francisco, that I truly fell in love with YA literature. In Marcelo, I found a character full of principles, vulnerability, questions about faith, honor, doing the right thing, and how to be a good person in a world that seems hell-bent on being corrupt and corrupting the young. And through his eyes, I felt like I saw the world anew. And it also opened up to me the true, absolute power of young adult literature and its importance to the young and to the grown-up. So it's my honor to be here. Like Etty said, I'm a teen services librarian at the Skokie Public Library. And another reason I'm very excited to be hosting this is because Francisco and I have interacted here and there over the last 10 years, but never met in person. And I guess this constitutes another one of those meetings that is not in person, but it's the closest we can get right now. We've exchanged emails, we've talked on the phone, we almost made it for a coffee in Chicago, but it didn't happen. And so I'm just thrilled to talk with an author who, ever since Marcelo in the Real World, has continued on a path, I believe, of writing deep, searching, and beautiful young adult literature in books like The Last Summer of the Death Warriors, The Memory of Light, Irises, Disappeared, and his most recent book, Illegal. So welcome and thank you to you, Francisco.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise. And before we begin, I want to take a moment for everybody who's in attendance to acknowledge the over 200,000 people who have died from COVID in the last 6 months in America. And not just the people who have died, but the families of those people, their friends and neighbors, who are almost certainly grieving deeply and will grieve for many years to come. Also, I want to acknowledge the people who have survived COVID and who may now live with lifelong disabilities and chronic illnesses. I think about the children and teens whose lives have been disrupted every day. And on top of that, over the last 4 years and beyond, the many countless children that have been separated from their families at the border with Mexico, the teenage lives that have been altered and traumatized, not to mention the parents and grown-ups and families that are bereft without their children. And I mention these things because these are realities, crimes against humanity that we live our daily lives alongside. And I mention this specifically because I find that, Francisco, your books often care deeply and think deeply about children like an unknown child who may have been separated at the border, what that child's experience of the world is like, and maybe what that parent of that child has experienced. And when I say that, I mean the stories, the many stories of how the world affects each and every one of us, for good and for bad. And it makes me think of a quote from Marcelo in the Real World, where Marcelo asks his friend, a rabbi, Rabbi Heschel, how can we live with so much suffering? And you, over the last 15 years, among being a grandfather and also a lawyer, have spent a lot of your time writing for teens and writing teen characters and living inside the minds of teenagers. And I just want to kick off tonight asking you, why? Why do you write for teens, and why do you care so much about teen characters? It's been 7 books now that, inside the heads of these young adults. And I'd like to know what it is that keeps you writing for them.
Well, I mean, I think there's a 2-part answer to that. One of them is that it's writing for young characters kind of comes out naturally, you know, and I think it's over the years I learned to pay attention to the things that kind of happen naturally within you. You know, the things, there's something to be said about, or there's a direction to be taken from things that come easy to you. And so it comes easy to me to write about young characters for some reason. Maybe because it was a very important period in my life. When I was a teenager, I lost my adoptive father when I was 13, and I probably experienced depression for the first time soon after that, even though I didn't know what to call it. There was issues with identity and living in El Paso, Texas, and you know, what to do with the rest of my life. And I think that, you know, it's just it's a very deep period, and it's a time really when some of those ultimate concerns are very present, right? And sometimes we lose those as we grow older, in the need to make a living and in the need to just live in the world, you know. But there's a special time when you're a young person, when you are when life hits you with its seriousness. And so because I'm interested in those ultimate concerns and in the seriousness of life, I think it goes well with my my delight in writing about young adult persons.
You've written in your journal, and for those of you who haven't checked out Francisco's website, he has kept a journal on there for about 10 years, and I highly, highly recommend just browsing through the posts on there. There's poems as well as thoughts about writing, life, reflections on the novels that he's written. And I've found it to be a constant source for a decade of thoughts that have kept me afloat. And you write in one about being very concerned about what you call the crimes against the spirit that the adult world inflicts on teens and young people. And you've also called it the subtlety of evil. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you mean by that?
Well, it's I think what I mean by that really is that the pretty soon after a young person, you know, goes to high school, there's a concern about status and the competition to become, you know, to be competitive, and to and this notion of American success, you know, and how we value people in accordance to the money that they make, or the degrees that they have, or how they speak. I mean, I think that notion kind of becomes ingrained in the psyche of the young people, and our psyche for that matter. And it really kind of, to me, it diminishes the spirit, in the sense that we are now living by images that are given to us by others, as opposed to our true selves, you know. And so it's a very subtle kind of thing. I mean, it's, the evil is not you know, you could miss it if you don't look for it, kind of thing. I think of Hannah Arendt and, you know, the banality of evil in some ways, and it's basically kind of it's kind of like living on the surface, and never really going for a deeper sense of what life is about, or creating your own ideals and trying to follow that. You know, I think that we just sort of stop thinking and just kind of get carried along by this. By these notions of what a successful person should be.
Your characters so often are desperately trying to hold on to that sense of self, I think, that sense of justice and what is right. And some of them are subverted by deep, either internal conflicts or problems with family. And is there a teen reader that you write for? Do you keep a specific one in mind, or who is it that you feel like, who do you feel like you're talking to when you write?
Well, all my characters are Mexican Americans, the main characters, and so I think in my mind I do have, uh, that young kind of Mexican American kid that is trying to figure out, what to do with his life. Someone who has a lot of worth, but maybe doesn't think of himself very highly, because of what others have told him, and so. I keep that in mind. I want when he reads my books, I want him to feel like there's someone who is saying something that maybe I've thought about before, but I hadn't had the words for, or and there's a sense of less loneliness that will happen. I hope through reading my book. So if I imagine a reader, it would be somebody like that, But really. It's not just that kind of reader. I'm also hoping that there will be, readers that are not Mexican American who will see, who will see Mexican Americans differently because of the books that I write.
Yeah, you talk a little bit about opening windows for others as you write, and I've thought that not being Mexican American, your books can do that. I feel as though I'm looking through a window into another life, and through that I feel empathic, and maybe that's where I can expand my sense of empathy towards young adults who are imprisoned at the border, or the story of somebody completely unlike me. And I think that's the power of literature, and part of why I'm so hooked on your books, I think.
Yeah.
Speaking of YA literature, I agree that I think having seen so many teens moved and connected to stories and books, and finding a sense of self, as well as not feeling so alone in the world. Partially, I am driven to connect teen readers with the good books that will mean something to them, whether it's an escape because they need it, or a way to find themselves. And you write in one post that you think that writers of young adult literature ought to stay at the margins. We ought to be okay with not belonging. We ought to feel uncomfortable wearing the mask of conformity. And that really struck home, because when I started in YA librarianship, I was just stunned by the first modern YA that I read was Shooter by Walter Dean Myers. And this was a book that's assembled like a police case file.
Yeah.
And as you read through journal entries and newspaper clippings, you get the story of what happened during this shooting event at a school and how it came to be. And I thought, my God, I've never read anything like this. And then another writer I like a lot said that he loves writing YA because there don't seem to be any rules. We're flying under the radar in the publishing industry. And so we can dispense with worrying about success and get to the heart of our characters. I think that's changed a lot in 10 years. I wouldn't call YA under the radar, but what do you mean by embracing margins and resisting conformity when you're creating? Like, what is that? It's a beautiful concept. I just wonder what it means to you specifically.
I think for me, it's the attitude that I like to have when I'm writing. Basically, kind of following my own heart and following the call of the story as I see it, and not being too concerned with whether the book is going to be successful or sell a lot or receive great reviews and so forth. So to that extent, I think that it helps me to feel like it's like I'm on my own in a way,
Mm-hmm.
like I'm not part of a group that I need to kind of adapt to. And in many ways, I am not part of the group. I mean, I'm older than most young adult writers. I'm a person of faith, which also separates you a lot from current writers in some ways. And I deal with topics of spirituality, which also sets you. But the thing about so being comfortable in the margins is being comfortable, being okay with who you are and believing that the best gift you can give to others is the honesty with which you write, and I truly believe that, and I think it's important to put yourself in uncomfortable situations. I'm very happy. I'm very glad now, for example, that I spent summers working with migrant workers in Alabama when I was going to college. That I spent summers working with the Lakota Sioux in South Dakota. Those are uncomfortable situations in some ways, but they help me. They help me to understand what others are going through. Probably the greatest experience that I had was in college. I lived in a halfway home for people that were mentally disabled. And, I didn't know that at the time, but there were probably people with autism there. There were people with different disabilities, schizophrenia, depression. And so later on in life, when I'm writing Memory of Light and when I'm writing Marcelo, there's a kinship now, and a way of seeing the world through eyes like the people that I lived with. That was just incredibly helpful. So, if I had stayed in a fraternity and partied, I would not have experienced these events that were so meaningful to me later on in life.
Yeah, and I wonder, were you a reader when you were in high school and college? I mean, did you consume a lot of books?
Yes. I was always reading. I was growing up at the time when the Latin American authors were kind of coming into their heyday. Borges and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Octavio Paz and all those guys that were just all of a sudden the world was taking notice of Latin America and South American writers and Mexican, and so I grew up with them in many ways. And in fact, when I went to graduate school, I majored in Latin American literature. I ended up being a lawyer, but all of that literature was with me, and really, I guess I honestly say that if that it was that reading, that it was the love of reading that kind of saved my life in many ways, and that it kind of people talk about the sacrifices that you make to be successful and so forth, but really to me it was just like it was that love of reading, that kept going back to and kept me going.
Yeah, I identify with that completely. Reading and writing, but especially reading. Big surprise, I'm a librarian. So I feel like that's a good segue into talking about your new book, and its companion or its predecessor. Illegal is Francisco's new book, and it's a sequel to a book that came out a couple of years ago called Disappeared. It's about Sarah and Emiliano, who in the first book live in Juarez. And I was wondering, I know that there are a couple personal reasons why you decided to write two books set in Juarez and then also on the American side of the border, and within the worlds of border patrol detention and talking about trafficking and immigration. So for those of you who haven't read it, Disappeared concerns itself with women in the city of Juarez who have disappeared. They've been kidnapped, and this is based on a reality. And in the main character, Sarah, her best friend, disappears, and she's a journalist, and she decides to go putting her nose where people think it shouldn't be to find out what happened to her friend. And then her brother becomes involved, and it's not a spoiler, but they end up in America, and that's where illegal takes over. I've heard people say that illegal can be read without disappeared, that it can be enjoyed without it. However, I think it's a richer experience if you read both. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience? Because I've read about it a couple of times, but others might not know about when you were 9 and and coming to El Paso and what your memories were.
Well, it was, my mother was a single mother. I never knew my biological father, but when I was 6, there was Charlie Stork was traveling through Mexico. Charlie was an American citizen, but he was born in the Netherlands, and he was older. He was in his 60s, but he met my mother and married her and adopted me. And soon after that, like a few years later, he decided to bring the family over to El Paso. He was not a wealthy man. We were living on a Social Security pension at that point. And for some reason, he thought that maybe we'd have a better go at it in the United States. But I think he wanted me to grow up in the United States. He felt that there would be I think more opportunities for me. So we came to El Paso, and we came on a June, and then in August I started school, and I didn't know English, so they sent me back a grade. And I remember in the school there was still a rule that you couldn't speak Spanish in the playground. So if you get caught speaking Spanish, they would send you to the principal's office, and he would whack you with his board. And I got whacked a few times, I guess. And that was kind of like, living in El Paso, it was like being part of Mexico in many ways. Juarez and El Paso are just like, you go back and forth, and it was I guess, it was, if there was prejudice against Mexicans, I didn't feel it, because there's so many of us there. I think that the hardship really started when Charlie Stork died in an automobile accident when I was 13, and it was just my mother and myself, and we decided to stay in the United States, but really there wasn't enough money. We had to live in the projects of El Paso, and it was a time of for me, it was a time of just constant fear, because it was a dangerous place, and I had to do everything I could to stay under the radar, and so you couldn't let anybody know that you like to read, and that stuff could get you into trouble, But so there was a lot of I think that was sort of the time when where the beginnings of what along the illness of depression began to kind of germinate within me and lasted for a long time. But it was also a wonderful experience, in terms of like the richness of that life, of that of Mexico right next to you, and Juarez. We would go to Juarez, and it was there was a richness and a goodness to it too.
Sounds like a very different time than now.
Yes.
The permeability of the border and how that's
very much, yeah.
Sorry, go on.
One of the things that has changed a lot, I think, is sort of like, it was the hostility that exists now towards the Mexican immigrant, that wasn't there at the time. I think it was more. When I was in high school, I used to work in construction, building houses out in the desert there, and all of the workers came from Juarez, so they would put me outside to be the lookout for the Border Patrol. And when I saw the little green Bronco the Border Patrol used to have, I would go in there and tell them, and they would all hide. And one time I was daydreaming or something, and they all got caught, and they were sent to Juarez. And then the next day they were back again, working and joking with me and kidding. And even if they were taken away, I could see them like kind of, they knew the Border Patrol people that were taking them away. So it was kind of like business as usual, you know, kind of the United States needed workers, and people from Mexico came, they worked, you know, and it was just a more accepted kind of thing. You know, there were economic ties between the countries, and there was no, there wasn't the kind of like them versus us that we have today.
And it's interesting, you both disappeared and illegal read like thrillers. I think they're thrillers. They still have that heart of doing the right thing and finding out what that is, and how can I, the characters thinking, how can I right grave wrongs? And I'm very thankful that you wrote about the desaparecidas, the disappeared women, because if they're not written about, they're disappeared. Stories are erased. And when I found out that Disappeared was about that, I became very excited because it was going to be in your hands. But I know I read that that writing these books were driven by your experiences growing up in Juarez and your concern about the missing women and girls, but also a very potent anger at the way immigrants and Latinos and anyone crossing the border have been, you know, met with vile racism and bigotry, and denounced, and violence waged against them. And you write very eloquently about the difficulty of anger and writing. You know, that anger is not necessarily the most powerful driver of creativity. So I'm curious, how do you feel like your anger or rage that you felt when you started the books is easier to let go of now that you've lived with Emiliano and Sarah for a couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, anger has a wonderful energy to it that if you can tap it, you know, it really does kind of drive you. I mean, the only problem with anger is that it can also, I think in a sense is antithetical to good literature, you know, because it ends up, you end up trying to tell a message, or trying to you know, beat people over the head with your real particular agenda or idea. And to me, literature is more about questions, you know, creating questions for the reader to then answer in their own way. But one of the things that happened, I mean, the anger came around the time of the last presidential election, when the Mexican-American was so caricatured, you know. And I just felt the need for, that I wanted to write characters that were complex. You know, I had the need for complexity. I wanted to tell people that how things in Mexico were, you know, how that it wasn't all cartels, you know, that there, and that there were businessmen, and there were creative people and reporters and heroes like Sarah, you know, who wanted to find the truth about the disappearance of the women. And so I kind of personally needed a little Mexican hero at the time, you know, and I created one in a complex way, and in a way that is not. I mean, these characters, Emiliano and Sarah, are heroic in the moral decisions that they make, but they're human too. You know, they're human in their temptations and in their loss of faith. I mean, in the myriad ways that we are human. And have faults. So I think, you know, I think it helped me. I think the anger was transformed by the love that I had that grew for these characters. And it's not to say that you can't be, you know, that you can't take the same passion of anger and use it for activism or creative ways, but ultimately, I think that for me personally, I can't speak for everyone, but for me personally, I think anger would ultimately hurt me, you know, and if I had to live with it for a very long time, and certainly hate, you know, when anger reaches the kind of the hotness of hate, then you're really in almost, you know, hurting yourself in many ways. At least I found that to be the case, you know.
You write a little bit about writing in fear. Also, you say that the world's great need will be met when you write the one novel you came into this world to write. It's the one that scares you the most, the one that you think no one will publish. And if it is published, then no one will read it. And if it is read, then no one will understand it.
I said that.
What
I'm not sure I said.
you did. You
That
did.
sounds a
It's
lot wiser than coming from me.
your journals are beautiful.
Yeah.
Which one of your books scared you the most when you were writing it, or is that is there a does that feeling work its way through all of your books, like something that is scaring you that you feel like you need to understand better or try
Yeah.
to conquer?
Well, I'm always conscious of taking of like I recognize the risk in a particular situation, you know, and I'm conscious of it, and then I decide that it's worth taking. I mean, I think that the one that scared me the most was The Memory of Light, which is a story of a young girl who's recovering from a attempted suicide, and it's a story of her healing really from depression. And so it scared me, first of all, to dwell into a subject that might lead me to depression again, you know, which is hard, always hard. But also, I mean, it was very important for me to get that book right. You know, if that book fell into the hands of a young person who is, you know, trying to decide whether to live or not to live, I wanted to make sure that that book pushed that person in the right direction, you know. And so I wrote like 3 drafts of that book before I felt like I could, like that was a book that I felt that I could give to someone and have confidence that they would find light in it. You know?
I think you captured depression incredibly realistically in that book, and what I like is that she has a trauma, the main character Vicky, but she also struggles with just ongoing sort of organic depression. And I feel like I don't read about that a lot in books, although it's such a reality for so many people.
Right.
And so many of us, I mean, if my Twitter feed is any indication, depression is an incredibly powerful force right now. And we're living through a collective trauma. And collective trauma that causes anxiety and depression. And it's personally very hopeful for me to read about young people who are trying to do the right thing and evading forces that want to take them down. You know, not winning in the end, but sort of making a difference. And you've written before about the importance of hope in YA literature. That YA literature, you almost as a writer have a responsibility to end with hope. I wonder why you think that is.
Well, you know, hope is not necessarily a happy ending, but it's I think it's sort of the characters having found a reason to found something good in life, you know, something that they want to continue living for. That's not to say that they're not still in the midst of hardship, or that, you know, Vicky never really gets quote unquote cured. You know,
Right.
She has to learn how to kind of live with depression. Sarah, you know, it's in a detention center, and there was great trauma that, you know, at the end that she experiences just because of that experience. But at the same time, you know, she says she believes that she has to keep on trying, you know, that trying is everything. And I think that that's kind of like the hope that you want to give to young people. And it's just not I guess one of the reasons that I like young adult literature, that it's okay to give hope, you know. You're not there's a teaching element in young adult literature that I like, you know, not teaching, not in the sense of being didactic, but really in the sense of like of guiding, you know, of sharing your wisdom with young people, and that's very hopeful to me, you know.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the importance of just creating generally as a person without regard for whether it will be good, whether it will be accepted by gatekeepers, whether publishers will like it, but just creating as a means to being alive, claiming your voice, climbing out of depression, dealing with anxiety. And you talk about writing without anxiety requires the delicate creation of what I call a bubble of faith. This very fragile and flimsy bubble contains within it the conviction that the effort is worth doing regardless of the results.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I really believe in that bubble. You know, there's two elements to the bubble of faith: the bubble and faith. You know,
Mm-hmm.
The bubble is really to me is a way to protect yourself while you're writing from the negativity. You know, you have to protect yourself somehow. Yeah, I mean, you have to disengage to a certain amount from the world in order to get at the world in a better way. You know, so. And so there is a certain amount of I think there's a certain amount of isolation that needs to take place in the writing process. And you just have to be willing to accept that, you know, for the period of time. But the most important thing about the bubble of faith is that within that bubble, you have somehow created in yourself the belief that you are worthy and capable of writing this story. And there's a certain kind of bravado to it, you know, a certain boldness, a certain confidence, you know, that you just have to kind of believe in yourself, you know, and you have to protect that belief because, you know, it's very delicate and it's very vulnerable. But when I'm writing, you know, I just kind of pretend that I'm a great writer and I'm going to pull this off. and that's what you have to do in the writing process. I mean, you have to kind of assume this sense that what you're doing is worthwhile and you can do it. You know, I have the benefit of feeling that, of knowing that I can't do it by myself, that I have help. You know, and so I am receptive. You know, that helps me even more because I know that I'm going to give it everything that I have, but ultimately, because it's a good book and because it would help people, there are going to be, you know, there's going to be a force that comes in and helps me to attain that end.
Mm-hmm. We only have a couple more minutes until we can get to some questions, but what do you think would have happened to you if you hadn't taken up? Okay, so you started writing and your first book was an adult book and it was published by a small university press, but very quickly you jumped into writing for teens. And you write a little bit about that if you have a pain inside of you, whether it be expressed in depression or anxiety, or something you can't fully understand, that the act of creation, whether it be painting, filmmaking, writing, journal keeping, that if the pain inside you is not let out in some creative way or some way that moves you forward, that it can be self-destructive, that it can lead to addiction and violence and pain. And it makes me wonder, what do you think would have happened to you if in the last 15 years you hadn't been committed to everyday writing for young adults?
Well, I mean, I have my family, and that will keep me going, you know. And you know, at the last 15 years of my life, I was working as a lawyer in a state agency that did affordable housing, and so there was a good, you know, there was a good attached to the work that I was doing as a lawyer. At the same time, you know, that without the writing, I think I would have always felt like that I wasn't really utilizing, you know, all the talents that were given to me, you know, and so that's, you know, I pulled myself out of depression and addictions and so forth, you know, because I had this this guiding light, you know, that kind of kept me going. But so creativity, I think that we're all meant to create. We are not meant to be artists or writers, but there's ways that we create in our lives every day, you know, in relationships, in the way that you are going to teach your son, you know, different things. It's just, there's creativity involved, you know, and so I think that one of the essences of being human is the ability to create, and that when that creativity is stopped, you know, we suffer in different ways. So.
Seems like the idea of the marketplace, or creating a product, or something valuable because someone else says it's valuable, is a significant force, kind of subverting creativity before it can begin.
Yeah.
Well, personally, I've gone through it, but thinking, what's the point? Why begin this? What's the point? You know, why should I tap dance? Why should I take up tap dancing lessons? I'm never going to be a tap dancer. But now, 20 years later, I regret that I didn't take tap dancing lessons. Now I don't have as much time for it, but I put this value on it that was someone else's. And I felt like it cut the flower before the flower could even grow.
Yeah.
And I worry about how many people just don't I wonder, not worry, but I wonder how many things don't get created because they're not a product.
Yeah.
Has that ever gotten in the way of your writing?
I try not to let it. I mean, at this point, I try not to think of the books as a product, or I think that I try to focus more on the process itself, you know, on the process and how. I mean, it's one of those paradoxes that writing is both deeply painful and deeply enjoyable at the same time. And you can't separate the two necessarily, but it's also really it's really worth doing. And you know, I really learned to write through my journal. You know, I started writing in high school, and I've written on it just about every day. This is what it looks like, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I go through one of these little books here like every 2 months, you know, because I write every morning. I get up and write, and that's what that does really, is that creates a sense of spontaneity in your writing, you know, where you really, after a while, the censor disappears, and you're just kind of, because nobody's ever going to read what I write. There's a total freedom there. But later, when I write a novel, it's still with me, you know, that freedom of just inventing and not caring, you know, that's, it's still there. And so it's really, I learned how to write through writing, you know, through writing in that journal, and getting the vocabulary and obviously, but reading, and, you know, so.
What would your advice be to a young writer? We have a question that says, advice for anybody writing?
Well, that journal is a wonderful, you know, for me, it's how I learned to write, and just write whatever comes to your mind, you know, and not worry about it. Nobody's ever going to see it, you know, and just keep doing it day after day, you know. Also, I mean, one of the things that I think is very that you have to think about as a writer is if you want to do it in a professional way, is you know, how to find a way to make a living that's compatible with writing, because you're not, you know, very few people kind of can make a living out of their books, especially on their first book, you know. So finding a way to do it, you know, I started working in high pressure law firms, and that was impossible for me to combine that with writing. But eventually I got to a job where it was 8 to 5, and I had weekends and so forth that allowed me to write. But so you got to find a job that doesn't occupy all your brain, but occupies enough of it that you're not broke. Right. And it's a difficult question, you know, and especially if you're in high school and you want to be a writer, what should you study and where should you go, and you know, it's kind of like, I think it's good to think of writing as something that you love, you know, but you have to find a way to make a living too.
Yeah. Speaking of that inner censor, your first book, Behind the Eyes, is I read it after Marcelo because I was hungry for more Stork books, and I liked it. But you note that your daughter, when she read it, said you held back when she finished it. And it's interesting because I felt like by the end of that book, you'd gotten to a real emotional and vulnerable place for the main character. There's a particular scene where he's sitting outside on the porch, and it really moved me. But I felt you talk a little bit about and maybe this is something to talk about with writers, but the idea of when you're writing, sometimes the wind is in your sails and sometimes you're rowing.
Right.
And your sails is an awesome feeling. The words are pouring out. And then other days you got to just like slog through it and row and row and row to get some words out. And when I read Behind the Eyes, I thought after Marcelo, the first half felt like a lot of rowing.
Yeah.
And I wondered if it being your first book for young people, if there was, and please talk about, you are rewriting that book and having the rare chance to change it, alter it, revise it. And I wonder if you could tell us what's the name, because it's changing a name.
Yes.
And how are you accessing the heart of that book? Is it the core of a certain character? Is it the story itself? How are you going back and finding that kernel that makes it honest and loving?
Yeah, the name of the book is On the Hook, and it's going to come out in 2021, probably the summer of 2021. And it's the characters are this, they have the same names as Behind the Eyes, and this general kind of story is a young boy who ends up in reform school because of trouble that he gets to with gangs and so forth. But really, it really is a new book. You know, somebody asked me, well, how much did you change? And I said it was about 90 to 95%.
Wow.
Of the book is different, and it's just a wonderful opportunity to be able to take all the experiences that I had from writing thrillers like Disappeared and Illegal, and writing deep books like The Memory of Light, you know, and Marcelo and Irises. So you'd be able to take all that experience and pour it into kind of this, use it in this new way, you know, in this book. It's really it's rare in life that you get second chances, you know. And so the rights to this book reverted to me after a few years. I was published by Dutton. The rights came to me, and Scholastic was willing to, ask me if I wanted to write a new book. And it's been, it'd be interesting for you to, now that you read Behind the Eyes, I'd love for you to read On the Hook and then tell me, because you'll see hopefully the growth that has happened in me, you know, as a writer and maybe as a person over the years, you know, between if you take a look at those good books. And that's kind of the essence of what we all want to do as writers, is to keep growing, you know, with each book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did your daughter read the new one?
Pardon me?
Did your daughter read the new one?
She hasn't read it yet. I'm afraid to let my family read my stuff, you know.
You what?
I'm always afraid to let her read my stuff. You know?
Is she a tough critic?
She catches things, you know, like, for example, you know, I once dressed a woman with a blouse and a dress, and she told me that doesn't really happen, you know. And so it's just...
Well, we have a couple comments here. Laurel says in the chat, just wanted to tell you, Francisco, The Memory of Light really got it right. It is hands down the best book I've ever read about the experience of depression. Thank you for your writing. I'm certain that you have changed lives.
Oh, thank you, Laurel. Thank you.
And with that, I think we're at the end. Is that right, Etsy?
Yes, we are winding down. Thank you both for an amazing conversation. I was furiously taking notes while y'all were talking. So lots of inspiration. I want to share again the link to purchase Francisco's books, support a local independent bookstore, or the one near you, because the great thing about doing Zoom events is we get to reach people from all over the country, which is really, really wonderful. We are also really honored to continue this partnership between Lincolnwood Library and Skokie Library, and we'll be hosting to promote our next collaboration, an evening with Kelly Yang and Jessie Ann Foley on October 15th, and you all are invited. I just want to put the link in the chat. And also you can come to all of our events and all the libraries events. A lot of libraries are doing virtual programs, and we hope that we can join together as a community in these kinds of experiences that connect us all. Are there any final questions or anything people want to share before we
I
end
just
for the night?
I see there's some questions. So, if I know we couldn't get to them today, but if you, in my website, franciscostork.com, there's a little place where you can contact me. And if you have questions that we didn't get to today and you'd like to ask them to me, just please go to my website and write your question. I'll get back to you.
And please do, when you're at the website, check out his journals and his writings, because there's a lot of great advice about writing inside those as well.
Excellent.
So, everyone. And thank you, Lincolnwood Library, for partnering with Skokie Library.
We are honored
to partner with a neighbor.
Yes. Right on. All right, friends, thank you all so much for joining us. We will have a recording available sometime in the near future. So keep an eye on all of our socials. We'll make sure to share it out and make sure to get that to all of you.
Take care.
All right. Bye, everybody.